Good evening, everyone. On behalf of AgriSearch and our partners in AFBI and our team of enthusiastic farmers, I would like to welcome you to this evening's webinar, Leatherjackets in Grassland, the Challenge. Before we start, a few items of housekeeping. You are automatically muted. Use the Q&A function and not the chat box to ask questions. Questions are public, and if you see a question someone else has asked that you would like answered, you can press the thumbs up button and that will put it higher up the rankings. If you have issues, leaving and rejoining will usually fix them. This webinar qualifies for the Register of Sheep Advisors CPD scheme points. Email rachel@agrisearch.org if you wish to get accredited for this with your membership number. The webinar will be recorded, and as always, we would very much appreciate it if you would complete the feedback survey at the end. And moving on, leatherjackets feed on the roots and stems of grass or cereal plants and can cause significant damage. In particular, grass reseeds and new leys can be devastated if leatherjackets are not controlled. With chemical controlled substances such as Durspan no longer available, this can pose a significant challenge. It was with this in mind that AgriSearch, with the support of our partners, applied and were successful at getting funding under the European Innovation Partnership Project to look at the potential mitigation strategies to control leatherjackets. This EIP project is jointly funded by the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development and the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. The project commenced in November 2020 and will conclude in June next year. The EIP project group is composed of 4 farmers from Fermanagh with technical input from AFBI and is led by AgriSearch. Our first speaker this evening is Dr. Archie Murchie, an entomologist from AFBI, who will give an introduction to leatherjackets, an overview of the project, and outline results to date. So I'll hand over to you, Archie.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, good evening, everybody. Just get my technicalities sorted here. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, Jason, and thank you all for joining us. I'm just going to give an introduction really to leatherjackets and the project as we see it, and really look at some of the issues that are pertinent to hopefully solving some of the leatherjacket problems. So leatherjackets are really the grub stage or larva of crane flies, also known as daddy longlegs. And there's 2 species of concern. The one that we're really probably dealing with most of the time is Tipula palidosa, which is this species here. This is the female with this spear tip and the male with the claspers. But there's another species that can also be a pest, Tipula oleracea, and that might actually be more common in the western counties of Northern Ireland. But in general, it's Tipula palidosa. Just to give you a little bit about a life cycle, so Tipula palidosa has a single generation. So you would see daddy longlegs sort of flying really the end of the summer, beginning of the autumn. They mate and lay their eggs, and then it's the leatherjackets that feed on the grass, the roots and underground stems during the autumn into the spring, and this is really when the damage is caused. There is a slight difference with Tipula oleracea, this other pest species, and that it can have 2 generations a year. So in some cases, numbers can build up quickly, I say, but in general, it's mainly the single generation Tipula palidosa that's the problem species. So the damage the leatherjackets do is they're herbivores, they're underground grazers, so feeding on the stems and the roots, and basically they just eat the grass. And this causes the plants to sort of die back, so you get yellowing, you get bare patches, and you can see it here in the distance, just where the leatherjackets are feeding most intensively. So another symptom, if you get an intensive infestation of leather jackets, is that quite often birds will come and feed. So you'd see this quite distinctive peck marks into the turf. So yeah, populations of greater than 0.5 million per hectare will cause measurable yield loss. The intervention for leather jackets is probably higher than that. So this is in the past where an insecticide would have been sprayed around about 1 million per hectare. I say, but anything above 500,000 will cause potential problems. And these are just some of the figures here about the damage that can be done. An average Northern Ireland, we're looking at losses of 0.5 tonnes dry matter per hectare due to leather jacket feeding. So as Jason mentioned, leather jackets previously were controlled quite successfully with insecticides. And this was mainly chlorpyrifos, which is an organophosphate insecticide with the commercial name Dursban. Now it was withdrawn by the European Commission back in 2016. And the reasons for that were primarily due to operator safety. So there were concerns that chlorpyrifos could potentially have an impact on human health. In addition to that, it's a very broad spectrum insecticide. So it's a general insecticide, which will, if it's sprayed in the environment, tends to kill all insects that it comes in contact with. If leather jacket damage is really severe, then other control measures are things such as reseeding. And this in general can be good practice, but the key point with reseeding is that you don't want to have an old ley that's infested with leather jackets and then put a new reseed down, and then that will allow the leather jacket simply to continue feeding. So the key point with reseeding is to have a sufficient gap so that the leather jackets are exposed through cultivation, but also they run out of food. So that is how the population would then be controlled. There's always a level of natural biological control within any crop, and certainly things like birds will feed on leather jackets. There are various diseases such as tubular iridescent virus. So populations can build up. Sometimes these diseases can take hold and dampen down the population. And then there's these little parasitic wasps, and this is really coming back to Rod, who'll be speaking later. Some of his work found that these little wasps, which are minute wasps, tiny wasps, that actually lay their eggs inside the leather jacket eggs, and the wasp will develop within the eggs. So it gives you an idea about how small these are. But it was found that in Northern Ireland, about 44% of tupulid eggs were attacked by these parasitic wasps. Now, that seems a lot, but what impact that is having on the general leather jacket population is really unknown. And it's something that we might, if we get a chance, certainly look at during this project. So these are the objectives of the project. The first two are really to have a look at the leather jackets and the problems that they're causing within the study area of Fermanagh. And then the second two objectives really are to see if we can learn any lessons, if we can look at any sort of management characteristics that are reducing leather jacket damage. And we're hoping to work very closely with the farmers within this project to see really what's feasible and what's practical. So some of the practicalities of the work we've been doing, we've been doing some soil sampling. So this is the typical way we'll sample for leather jackets. We'll take a soil corer, and this is 10 centimeters. So it takes the core here, which we then take back to the laboratory. And these are then washed through with a jet of water through various sieves and placed in saturated salt solution and this brings the leather jackets to the surface where they can be counted. So we then look at basically the hin end of the leather jacket, and by looking at these sort of anal papillae and the position of the spiracles, we can determine the species. But as I said earlier, most of what we have found is Tipular palidosa, so the single species. The other method of sampling, and this is one that farmers can use on the farm, it's a relatively low cost and simple method, is to use these drainage pipes. So these are also 10 centimeters in diameter, and these are just forced into the soil, and a saturated salt solution is poured in. So this is just a salt solution that is fully saturated, and you can tell that because the crystallized salt is visible at the bottom. So this really brings, again, the leather jackets to the surface, and they float and can then be counted fairly easily. I said that John was just mentioning, John will speak later, but we were doing some sampling today. I would have to mention that the success of all of these methods, to a certain extent, depends on the soil conditions. So just looking at the two methods, the soil cores are along the x-axis and the brine pipes along up against the y-axis, and this really just demonstrates that the two methods are comparable. So although the soil cores is more accurate in general, it's also a lot more time consuming. So we using the brine pipes, we're probably looking at about 80% accuracy compared to the soil core, but I say as a general method that can be used in the farm, it's ideal. So these are the results from last year, looking at the 4 farms, and the number of leather jackets is up the y-axis here, up to 5 million. This red line is where we're starting to see economic damage, and these are the farms and the fields that were sampled along the x-axis. These were randomly selected fields because we just wanted to get a general idea of what the leather jacket counts were without particularly targeting fields. With the exception of these 2 fields here, which were from another farmer who had leather jacket problems, and we sampled his fields as well, and the numbers were very high indeed, up to 4 million per hectare. But we can see just from the standard farms that we're getting leather jacket numbers in some farms, not all farms, but above the economic threshold, above the yield loss threshold, and certainly causing damage. So I say one of the aims of the project is to look at some of these fields and try and work out just exactly what's going on. It can be tricky. So these are 2 adjacent fields, as I mentioned, with a farmer who contacted CAFRE just out of interest in terms of leather jacket counts. And this is actually where this photograph was taken, was in the gateway between the 2 fields. And we can see there's quite substantial differences. So this field here had about 4.2 million leather jackets per hectare, and really quite notable visible damage, whereas this close by field, the damage was a lot less, and it was about 0.89 million leather jackets per hectare. So some of the factors that might be influencing leather jacket numbers within pasture, and this is from a study in Scotland back in 1995, but they found things like the aspect of the field, which direction it was facing, how it was sloped, how waterlogged it was, proximity to the sea, and this is probably to do with how mild the climate is in Scotland, so I think in Northern Ireland this might not be too relevant. Leather jacket counts from previous years, there's a carryover effect, how productive the field was, application of slurry, and grass height at the time of sampling. And I say this is something that has been noticed by a number of the farmers, is that if the grass can be really grazed off, So going into the autumn and into the winter, there seems to be evidence or anecdotal evidence at least that leather jacket numbers are lower, and something we're going to try and follow up on. Just some of the results from our own study is that certainly previous leather jacket problems are a good indicator that there will be leather jacket problems to come, perhaps as you would expect. And also we found that reseeds were in general beneficial. So the earlier, the more close the reseed was, then the better for the less damaging the leather jacket problem. So just really to finish up now, the challenges going ahead is, why do some fields suffer more leather jacket damage than others? And there are going to be environmental and biotic factors such as microclimate, soil moisture, annual fluctuations due to a density-dependent population regulation. Rod might mention that. And also, but from our purposes, we're really more interested in factors to do with management, such as grazing in particular. How can we mitigate leather jacket damage? Well, I think, certainly going ahead, we had very good control through intervention in the past. We could spray and treat leather jackets, but I think we're looking at a different approach. We're looking at a multi-season, long-term management approach to mitigate the population levels. So it's not going to be an instant kill. It's going to be a more long-term process. And once we sort of look at some of these issues, we're hoping to convey a sort of best practice model for what leather jacket control should be like in Fermanagh. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Archie, for that interesting talk. And just a reminder to you all that you can put questions at any time in the Q&A box. So as I said earlier, we've been working with 4 farmers from Fermanagh in this project. And tonight we're joined by group member John Egerton, who I'm sure would need absolutely no introduction to anyone here. A farms near Rosslea in County Fermanagh, and he will give a farmer perspective of the leather jacket challenge. So John, hand over to you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm John Egerton, just an ordinary farmer, not a scientist, just a farmer trying to make a living. I farm in southeast Fermanagh, along with my 3 sons. We have 180 acres. We farm suckler cows to beef, sheep. We also contract rear dairy heifers, and we have a blade calf house. I pride myself in my grassland management, and anything that affects that grassland management has to be dealt with somewhere or other. In the past, I didn't know what leather jackets were or what leather jacket damage was. When I was younger, I used to see patches in the field where the grass wasn't growing. I blamed it as being poor ground or wetter areas of the field, areas that the rushes were growing in. I imagined that it just needed slurry or fertilizer to get it going in the springtime. I tried to blame everything except the leather jackets, but when I realized it was leather jackets, at that stage Dursban was legal, and for many years we used Dursban. It wasn't a cure for the leather jackets. It killed the leather jackets that were there and reduced the likelihood of a massive return of them the following year. It didn't do anything. By the time you had realized there was a leather jacket problem, it had the damage done to the ground. So it didn't rectify the damage, but it prepared you for other years. Since the ban, I have tried to take my grassland management to the next level, to ensure that I would have no risk of leather jackets or less of a risk of leather jacket damage. We have drained all the wet areas of the farm. reseeded the old pastures. We try our best to manage the grass especially in the autumn time. It seems to be that August, September time. If you can keep the covers of grass at a low level in August and September, it seems to reduce the likelihood of a leatherjacket problem. This is fine when the weather's suitable. It's not always the case in Fermanagh. In the autumn of 2020, we had a very wet autumn in Fermanagh here. There were heavy covers of grass in that August, September time. Grass had grown well during the summer. Cattle were doing a lot of damage. There was heavy covers that should have been cut and weren't cut. It was ideal conditions for the daddy longlegs to lay their eggs. And sure enough, in the spring of 2021, we had severe damage due to leatherjacket infestation. Something I hadn't seen for a good number of years. And again, I tried to blame other things. I tried to blame the wet autumn the previous year and carryover of dead grass. But when I started to dig a hole, it wasn't long till I realized that there was something more there. What can you do about it? There's no chemical that we can use at the minute. There's lots of my farmer friends will talk about roll the ground, especially at night. I'm not a big fan of rolling ground here in Fermanagh. The ground is well enough panned without getting on it with a heavy roller. Others suggest slurry or sown fertilizer. I would doubt whether they have much benefit. What we had to do was we just had to smile and take the pain and try and move on to the next year and try and manage the grass a little bit better. A couple of years ago, this EIP project came up, and I was very lucky to get involved with it. It has given me a new insight into actual life cycle of the daddy longlegs or the leatherjackets. And there's a lot of people having a lot more damage than I'm having, but if I can in any way help somebody else, or my management steps can help someone else to alleviate the problem, that's a job well done. My take on the thing is that grassland management is key, especially the grassland management in that August, September time. But this is not always possible in Fermanagh because of the weather conditions. So we may need another option. I don't like to have to use chemicals unless we absolutely necessarily have to do it. But there may be times that we need some chemical. This project may identify something that we can use. Hopefully we'll be fit to find other mitigating. There's a possibility that multi-species swards may have some benefit. It's not proven yet. I have started a little bit of multi-species swards, but it's very early days yet. So we're always on the lookout for some other way rather than chemicals to alleviate the problem. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Thank you very much, John, for that. So our next speaker is Professor Rod Blackshaw. Rod has done a lot of work in the past in Northern Ireland, and he's going to give us some of his historic context over his work from his many years of working in this field. And I'm delighted Rod has joined us here this evening. So Rod, I will hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to go down memory lane for me. Some of the work I'm going to tell you about I started over 40 years ago now, but it still seems very fresh and relevant. So what I'm going to do is take you through, if I can, the work we did around the annual Leatherjackets survey that used to take place in Northern Ireland from the mid-1960s up to the mid-1980s. So it's about 21 years of this. And this would involve sampling about 50 grass fields each year with 20 soil cores and extracting the leather jackets, as Archie has shown in his presentation. The sorts of data we got from it, you can see here on the left, where we can look at population sizes, population along the x-axis there, and the probability of a field having that population on the y-axis. And you'll see most of the fields, most of the time, have fairly low populations. But bearing in mind that 500,000 per hectare damage threshold, you see a fair number of fields are where we would expect to see damage occurring. Occasionally you get very large populations, and I think the largest we recorded was 6.7 million per hectare. Now the map on the right is an attempt that we made to show the spatial distribution of these leather jacket counts across Northern Ireland. And the darker areas are where you get higher numbers. And these are fairly solid data that you get this sort of patchy distribution. They're not equally distributed across Northern Ireland. And of course, the more astute of you will have noticed that we have a blank for Fermanagh. And the reason for that is that the survey data no samples were collected from Fermanagh, because the field officers collecting the samples, their main job was collecting soil samples for potato cyst nematode extraction. So they were working mainly in the potato growing areas. So that's the reason why we didn't know anything about what was going on in Fermanagh. Although even in the early 80s, I was aware the only farmers I knew of who were using insecticides against leather jackets were in Fermanagh. So we took those data and we put them together with a database of weather variables and produced a model based upon the weather that would allow us to predict the average population density for Northern Ireland. And this is the model here. And you'll see it has a number of variables in from a number of months and things. You don't need to look at that too closely. But what I would point out is that there's a number of positive and negative factors going on. And that helps to, in ecological terms, it helps to stabilize the population. So Northern Ireland, in comparison with other regions of the UK, for example, doesn't have very wide fluctuations from year to year in terms of the numbers. And if we look at the model outcomes, this graph on the right, the open circles are the observations and the closed circles here are what came out in the model. And you see there's a fairly good fit. And I'm hoping you can see on the right down here, which is masked by, around here, this red circle, that's where we use the model to predict what the populations would be. And the fit's not quite as good, but it's still a pretty good fit. So we now, at that point, we had a model that we could use based on weather variables, and we didn't actually need to do the survey any longer. We then extended that model to predict field population sizes. And these three histograms here, bar charts, show with different threshold levels a comparison between the observed and the predicted number of fields each year that would have populations above those thresholds. You can see from this, it's actually a fairly good prediction. So where we got to with our modeling was that we could predict high and low risk years. So we could say whether there's a lot of leather jackets about and whether there's not many. Well, there's two problems with that. The first is that just because there's a lot of leather jackets around doesn't mean you know where they are. And we saw from that example that Archie showed of two adjacent fields, you can have quite markedly different populations in them. And so even if you know it's a high risk year, you still have to find out which fields are at risk. In a low risk year, there's still going to be some fields that will be suffering economic damage. So you equally need to be able to identify those. And the second caveat with these models is that the survey was intended for predictions for spring barley going in after grass. And that means that the survey actually took place November, December, January time each year. And that may be too late for the sort of interventions you might be looking at in order to prevent damage for the next season. So coming back to grassland production, we did a series of experiments in Fermanagh, field trials, looking at different spray application dates using chlorpyrifos and looking at the herbage yield you got around the time of the first silage cut the next season. There was quite an interesting set of studies, and we had some quite amusing encounters with the British Army who were a bit perplexed by what we were doing, but that's another story for another day. But what the big outcome from it, which is captured in this figure where we look at as herbage value increases, depending upon what you're using it for, and look at the change in the margin per hectare, we see with these two lines here, that's where you apply in September, an insecticide in September, and that's the bottom three lines is where you apply one in March. You're still getting a yield response applying that late, but quite clearly, if you can get on before the winter with an insecticide, if that's your chosen control method, then you're going to get better yield responses the next spring, early summer. Now, how do you know which fields to look at? Well, Archie showed you this do-it-yourself method. One of the things we did when this method came out is we looked at, ask the question, could we reduce the number of samples and the amount of work involved? And we came up with this thing based on fairly standard methods, but called sequential sampling, where you don't need to take the full sample, in this case 12 soil pipes. You can take a number and then take a decision if you have either very low numbers of leather jackets recovered or high. So if you took 4 pipes, for example, did a sample of that, and you didn't find any leather jackets, there's actually no point in going on. You can decide that you don't need to treat that field. Or if you had 7 or 8 in it, you'd say, I definitely do, and I don't need to carry on. So it's only where you've got populations near that damage threshold that you're working to that you actually need to take more samples to sort out whether you're above or below that threshold to help your decision. So we can improve the efficiency of the sampling methods and the reduce the resources and effort you need to put in. But a big question is, what's the best time to sample? And this was another study we did over 5 years with monthly samples where we measured the larvae and allocated them to different instars. So the different growth stages of the larvae. And this graph here just shows the data over that period. The graph on the right, top right here, shows the timing and duration of leather jacket instars coming from those data. The first instar, second, third, and fourth. And you can see there's a progression through those. There's overlap between the instars, but they progress towards maturity. This graph at the bottom brings together all the data as adjusted counts, so we can look at it in the totality. And there's a couple of things here. One is that in October, which is when you've got mostly first instar larvae around, there's a lot of variability in the counts, a lot more variability than there is later. And so your chances of getting an accurate assessment of them are less than with later instars. And that's just because they're small and fiddly and hard to find. I might also say that with the brine flotation, I don't think it actually works for first instar larvae very well at all. Either they don't float up or you just cannot see them against the background of other stuff that's floating on the surface. The second thing, though, is that you've got this fairly level population over the winter months, and it's not until you get to about April, and that's where you start getting the fourth instar coming in, that population's numbers in the field start to decline. And this may tie in with something that Archie was saying about the timing of interventions to reduce numbers and things. So for me, if you're using this brine flotation method, you really need to use it sort of November time onwards. And that counts against the other conclusion, which is the earlier you make your intervention, if you're using a pesticide, the better the yield response will be. So to summarize this sort of bit of work, we can predict the level of risk using models based on weather, but the data for these came from the other 5 counties, and we don't know if the models will work in Fermanagh. And certainly we don't know whether they're going to be timely enough to be useful. And that's particularly because knowing the risk does not tell you as farmers where your problems are. It's knowing your fields that will do that. If you're making an insecticide intervention, whether it's a chemical or a biological one, then the earlier the better. And that's because the larvae, the leatherjackets, are generally in the sort of climate you've got in Fermanagh, are feeding throughout the winter. They don't actually stop much below until the soil temperature gets below about 2 degrees. We've got simple DIY field monitoring methods exist, which you can use. But my view is they're not particularly accurate before November. If you've got a shed load of leather jackets there, that won't matter. It's only if you're dealing on the margins about whether you actually need to have an accurate assessment to take a controlled decision. And my view, which echoes that of others, is that you actually need to consider a multi-year management approach rather than saying I have a problem now that I need to deal with in this season and take a controlled decision. So that sort of wraps up what I was going to say there. I've got another slide here, which is not about grassland, but it's about a piece of work I was involved with in the southwest of England for organic vegetable producers who are also having problems with leather jackets. And for them, the problems are because they use grass for fertility building in their rotations. And what we did was we linked in what we understood of the population dynamics of how populations recover from low numbers by just asking the simple question, how long has your field been in grass? And then depending on how long, it takes you to different actions. And if you've less than a year in grass, you don't actually need to worry because your cultivations from your previous cropping, vegetable cropping, will have hammered the leather jacket populations. And my experience of organic vegetable growers is they beat the soil nearly to death in an effort to control weeds. So this sort of interim thing, 1 to 2 years, you may get numbers above a threshold, and then it depends upon what you tend to grow. If you're growing cereals, they'll be fine because you've got a greater plant density. They can tolerate a few losses. If you're growing vulnerable vegetables such as brassicas or lettuce, they won't. There's fewer plants there, and each leather jacket, just taking out one plant, will have a big impact on overall yield and margins. And so that route, and if it's been there more than 2 years, you sample the field, and again, you say, what are you going to grow? And eventually it takes you down to a range of non-chemical things that you can do. Either nothing, get in early with your cultivation so you can, for example, take a rotavator through a second time and really hammer the leather jacket numbers down. If it's too bad, you plant another crop that's not going to be susceptible to leather jacket damage. Or in this one, for example, which a lot of the growers in the southwest do with brassicas, is they delay planting until July when the when the leatherjackets are entering the pupal phase and they're not feeding, so they can grow their winter brassicas then. But that just gives you an idea of the sort of way we can integrate the scientific information with what farmers know and what they do. I'll stop there.
Thank you very, very much, Rod. That's very interesting. Our next speaker this evening is Aisling Moffat, who is currently undertaking a PhD studentship with the University of Edinburgh and Chuggas on leatherjackets. She is going to give an overview of her findings from her work from right across Ireland. Aisling.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thanks, Gillian. I'm delighted to be here. I'm just wondering, is my camera working? It possibly isn't.
Not yet, no.
Okay, 1 second now. There we go.
Yes, that's you.
Hi. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here, especially with the likes of Rod and Archie, who I've referenced throughout the PhD. So yeah, my work is working on leather jacket control, so trying to make a more sustainable IPM approach for farmers against these pesky pests. So I'll launch into what I've been looking at. But first, I said I'd give an overview of what we've talked about already, which is the IPM approaches that we know already. So as we've spoke about already, that larvae love waterlogged soil, so you're already at a benefit if your soil is well drained. We've mentioned that ploughing reduces populations by up to 50%, but for grassland farmers, this is often not very viable. John himself mentioned rolling, and I've talked to similar farmers who get up at dusk or dawn to roll the fields, but obviously it's extremely site specific. And we've mentioned also tightly grazed swards in autumn or also in summer, because adult crane flies love to hang on to the long grass, so this is also an option, but the effectiveness is unknown. And then we know that there are some commercially available biocontrols such as nematodes, typical iridescent virus, or bacteria such as BT, but these have worked in the lab and often don't work at field level. And they're commercially available for amenity grasslands such as golf courses and other amenity grasslands, but they're not economically viable for farmers as an option. And as we've said already, chlorpyrifos was the effective control for leatherjackets, but has since been banned by many authorizations in the EU in particular for use in agriculture. So we're kind of left with very little options. So this is where my project will come in to play as well as the EIP project. So the challenge in Ireland was that up till the PhD, there was no survey conducted in the Republic, and we need to know the species of economic importance before we even apply any IPM approaches, because you need to know the biology and the life cycle and be able to pinpoint that vulnerable stage. So my research aims were to conduct this national survey and to find out that species of agronomic importance in the farms in Ireland. And then I want to relate the populations to soil factors that we're measuring, such as characteristics, like chemical characteristics and soil type, and then to create a general management advice for farmers going forward. So from the national survey, I sampled 136 fields across Ireland. You can see that there's green and orange pins, which I sampled in 2019 and 2021. And from these, over 75% of the larvae collected were identified as Tipula pallidosa. So as Archie said, they have one life cycle and they spend 11 months in the soil. So this is a really important factor to know before trying to find any control for them. And from my observations, the grasslands farmers were disproportionately affected, and this could be due to the lack of ploughing or soil inversion, and populations build up over time. And there were specific issues on the west of Ireland with really, really high leatherjacket populations. And from my survey, so I did survey Ireland and I surveyed Scotland as well. I continued with the annual survey there. And the sites sampled, 43% of them in Ireland were over that economic threshold that Archie and Rod mentioned. And in Scotland, it was really high, 72%. And this is interesting when you compare it to the tillage in Ireland, which is only 18%. So definitely not as affected as grassland farmers. And then when it came to the soil factors, there were many that we took into account, but the ones highlighted here in the yellow circle was what was significant to larval populations. So magnesium, phosphorus, and pH were negatively correlated with leatherjacket populations. And this means that when leatherjacket populations were high, these factors were low in the soil. So here I've left the pH range that we had, and we were actually seeing that larvae were optimum in pHs of about 5.8, which is uncommon because the average pH suggested for grassland is 6.2. So maybe this suggests that it's an overall management issue that I was seeing on the farms that I sampled, but we need to look into this further. And then for grassland management advice, I've taken 2 routes here. So I'm currently looking at microbial analysis. So from my survey of the grassland sites, I'm doing bacteria and fungal community analysis. So I will relate leatherjacket populations, both high and low, to their associated bacterial and fungal counts. And this might pinpoint maybe a biocontrol for the future and send us down the right path for that. But also I wanted to have some quite practical advice. So I set up a controlled larval feeding experiment, and John mentioned the multi-species sward. So that's actually what I looked into, and I'll go further into that in the next slide. So we set up a multi-species grassland trial last year, and the 2 currently ongoing this year as replicates. And I set up monocultures of perennial ryegrass, plantain and chicory, which are 2 herbs, white clover and red clover, all as monocultures. And then there was pots with all 5 species, or the multi-species mix. And there were 2 treatments throughout the experiment. So there was pots that didn't receive any leatherjackets, and then pots that received leatherjackets, and it would be 12 leatherjackets per pot. And they stayed there for their full life cycle, so 11 months. And at the end of this experiment, I compared the yields of both the shoots and roots of the pots that received leatherjackets and the ones that didn't. And I compared if there was any yield loss in each pot and how the multi-species functioned overall. And I have some quick conclusions on the next slide. So we could see that there was significant yield loss in the white clover swards. And this isn't new information to us. We know that larvae actively feed on white clover. That's been in previous papers. But this is an issue because in Ireland, the main sward composition would be perennial ryegrass white clover mix. So if you're a farmer who has high populations, you'll lose that benefit of the white clover addition. And what was also interesting is that we received or retrieved larval populations, the highest larval populations from plantain, but there was no significant yield loss. So this might indicate that plantain can cope well with feeding stress or has a different response than other plants. And that's something we'll look further into in the 2 ongoing experiments. And extremely interesting was the multi-species, that there was no significant yield loss compared to the treatments. And actually larval feeding increased diversity because in the species, the mixed species, larvae actively fed on the grass and white clover, and that gave a chance to the plantain and chicory to increase in the sward. So this could combat kind of the persistency issues that we're seeing in other multi-species situations. And I'm hoping that these experiments will kind of lead to the incorporation of a more diverse grassland sward, because as you know, there's so many different benefits to the inclusion of different species. And then when we pair this with the soil analysis and the microbiome work, we'll kind of generate an IPM toolkit for Tipula pallidosa, and it'll be slightly more sustainable than any chemical. And yeah, so I'll leave it at that. But if you've any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you very, very much for that, Aisling. That was really, really interesting. So our final speaker this evening is Gillian Hoy, who's research manager with AgriSearch, and she's going to outline the results of a farmer survey we undertook on leatherjackets. And my thanks to all the farmers who participated in that, with over 300 responses. So Gillian, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Apologies for my voice. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. I've got a touch of the cold. I'm just going to run you through sort of one of the first aspects of what this EIP Leatherjacket project did. And it was really to gather the information that we knew was out there in Northern Ireland that perhaps just hadn't been collated, and to sort of give the project a wee bit of a sort of a baseline to move forward from. So we issued an online Northern Ireland Leatherjacket survey back in the summer of last year, and that ran straight through until the autumn. So hopefully many of you might have participated in that, and thank you if you did. We had in total 335 responses, and of those, 226 reported that they had had issues with leather jackets in the previous 5 years. And you can just see over in the left here sort of the total count of responses from each county and whether or not they had an issue, that's in the blue column, or if they hadn't in the orange. And if we work that out in percentage, you can see down here on the right, Fermanagh was coming up with, of their responses, 92% had had issues with leather jackets in the last 5 years. So if we look at that in a wee bit more detail, of those then that reported that they had an issue, we can see over here on the left the regularity of that occurrence. So again, on the left, we're looking at the total numbers of responses, and you can see the patterns there, with the blue columns being an annual problem, the orange being every few years, and the grey being only once in the past 5 years. And if we go again down to the table on the right, we can see that 60% of the respondents in Fermanagh were really seeing that leather jacket issue occurring on an annual basis, with another 35 every 3 years. So that really coming up is quite an issue there. So we went further in the survey, and we also had a look at what the farms were telling us with regards how often the leather jackets were found in only a few fields or across the whole farm. And as you can see, nearly 75% were finding only a problem in a few fields only. So that again raises those questions that Archie has touched on before, and Rod as well, why those fields? And also raises maybe the question of how did each of the farmers know that the leather jackets were present? So that was another question in the survey. And as you can see down here in the table, sort of lack of grass dead, dying was a key indicator, dead grass, and then digging into the soil, and visual evidence as well. So those sort of visual signs were the main ones. And if you come down to the bottom, really digging a soil pit was really only used by maybe one person that responded in the survey. So there is maybe scope for additional use of some of those sort of simple brine sampling methods that Archie described as well, because that would give you a bit more of an idea of how many million per hectare you are getting, and where you maybe sit in that threshold as well. So when we go back more to why those fields, Aisling and Archie and Rod have all touched upon maybe what sets certain fields apart, but we want to sort of gather the opinions from the farms as well that we're seeing these problems, and see what information we could get that way too. What we got back in this question, do the affected fields have anything in common? And we got a very mixed response. So actually most popular was the fact that there was maybe nothing in common, nothing that jumped out at any of the respondents that really tied those fields together. But in saying that, we also got good responses for sort of wet, heavy ground, which we'd mentioned before. And again, sort of arable or reseeds were a high feature as well. But regardless of what those affected fields had in common, what we did get back from each of the farms was that 75% of them did think that the presence significantly impacted on their grass growth and the grass availability in farming. So that is something that we do need to take some action upon it, and try and drive forward some of those mitigation steps to help those farms. We also wanted just to gather and find out a bit of information about what people have been doing themselves about how they've been controlling leather jacket populations. We're trying to reduce the likelihood of an infestation. And what you can see sort of again is there's a lot of variability here. We've gathered and grouped some of the responses into these main categories here. Now, the most common that people had used in the past was obviously using spray, and that's no surprise there, but that was followed quickly by no action at all. So we can sort of see that in the absence of us the availability of spray, many farms out there are sort of left scratching their heads a bit and not knowing what to do. So really taking no action at all there. But just up at the top here, we can see that grassland management has featured, rolling as well, which John mentioned too. And so the grassland management features probably is something we definitely are going to try and take forward with this project, as someone has mentioned before. But I'll leave it there. This is sort of just a very quick snapshot of the online results, and we will publish the full results in due course as well. But just to give you a wee bit of a view of what we collected and the view from across Northern Ireland at the minute.
Okay, thank you, Gillian. So now we come to our Q&A. So reminder, you can stick your Q&A in the box at any time. And up for other answers you want. One of the answers there has been couple of people have indicated interest in is on lime. Now, actually, you mentioned that I think in your study. Would addressing of lime in the autumn help? Now, maybe that's to do with pH, but perhaps I'm guessing it's maybe also to do with the fact that lime might kind of almost desiccate a field to a certain extent. But any indications on what lime in the autumn might do?
Yeah, I think any aspect to maybe raise the pH would be beneficial. It does seem that they either don't like it or just thrive less in higher pH. So I would kind of recommend that, but I need to look more into it, obviously. But yeah.
Archie, have you any thoughts on that one?
No, I would just agree. I don't know of any research offhand. I'll probably pass this on to Rod, to be honest. But I think in general, you know, having a pH around about neutrality is better for you know, a range of other soil fauna, earthworms, etc. So we'd be encouraged. So yeah, I mean, I'd really go back to Aislinn's findings that it certainly wouldn't do any harm.
Rod, maybe start. I'll get you to answer that one, but also let me then take a start at the next one, which was, does slurry benefit leather jackets? You know, what effect does slurry application have with leather jackets?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, that, because I'm not aware of anybody who's looked at it directly. Maybe Archie knows of some work on this, but the leather jackets typically, you know, as they get older, they live in little U-shaped burrows that are open to the surface. So you would imagine that the slurry would get down there and might even irritate them to bring them to the surface, like it does with earthworms, for example. But I think there's a two-edged thing here, because one of my memories of going out looking at leather jacket damage in Fermanagh was going to a farm where the population was actually only about 250,000 per hectare, but the sward was utterly destroyed. And when I talked to the farmer and worked out what was going on, it was a wet autumn and he'd done sacrificial slurry application on the field just to get his store cleared. And that had stressed the plants so much that they just couldn't recover from the feeding of the leather jackets. So it may have an impact, but it could also have a deleterious effect on the grassland management.
Okay, that's fine, thank you. Paul Fagan asks, if heavy covers were left on fields last autumn to extended graze into the end of November, will that have created a leather jacket infestation? Do pastures need to be grazed off early to prevent leather jackets? If winter covers develop during mild winters, is that less risky than leaving some cover in autumn to facilitate early turnout? So it's this kind of idea of some deferred grass. I know, Archie, you've looked at some of that.
Yeah, well, I say there's anecdotal evidence that we're getting from some of the farmers, you know, to graze out as much as possible, graze the grass off as much as possible. And I was interested when Aisling said about, you know, something similar down south about, you know, during the oviposition when the leather jackets are laying their eggs, their behavior is to hang on to the grass. So yeah, but I guess it's a tricky one, Jason. We don't know for certain, but this was one of the potential avenues we're pursuing. And I mean, it's useful to actually get this feedback, you know, through the questions. Although I'm not answering them, but it's very valuable for us, you know, for some of these ideas.
Okay. Have you any thoughts on that, Aisling, at all?
No, I'd kind of echo what Archie has to say there, to be honest. It's hard to pinpoint these questions because there's so many aspects that, like, I ask farmers when I arrive on their fields and they all have different mechanisms that they do. So it's hard to correlate it fully. But yeah, I agree with what Archie would have to say.
Okay, I'm seeing someone here saying, Kieran Lavelle saying, secondary damage by crows feeding on leather jackets is a lot of harm to playing pitches with sound carpet-based pitches worst affected. These playing pitches are well maintained with short grass cut length, well drained and good nutrition. So what can you do? So that's maybe more a horticulture and agricultural question, but any thoughts? Anyone at all?
Yes.
Might be able to apply nematodes like the golf courses do, but Depends how large the pitches are and how viable
What-
that is economically.
Yeah, there's some. I mean, there is like a cellar crane, isn't it, Rod?
Yeah.
but it's emergency authorization for I think turf grass in some cases. Control. I'm just saying.
No,
just looking at-
it's been authorised for the last 2 years in the UK under Directive 1107/2009, which is a nice mouthful, but it's emergency authorisation, and it's authorised on up to 10% of golf course cover, greens, fairways, tees, and also on horse racing gallops and race courses, and indeed on aerodromes, where of course birds feeding on crane flies are a potential big problem with jet engines, the bird strike. So there is a chemical around for amenity stuff. I don't know whether it's not authorized for this particular use unless it's on a golf course.
Okay.
You know, but I think the thing is, if you've got, if you wish to bring in another sort of amenity turf to that, you need to work with the applicants. And I think it was led by the Turf Research Institute last year, and you need to get added on to that for consideration.
Okay, thank you, Rod. Someone here has said, an anonymous attendee says they've noticed more of a problem in fields close to conifer plantations. Have any of you come across any associations and why it may be close to conifers?
Yeah, I just wonder if that relates to the pH.
Yes, I was just thinking the same
Yeah.
thing, because trees will generally acidify ground, so it could be a pH issue. Yes.
Yeah.
Or even an adult kind of habitat. They do like kind of trees and bushes to stay in. So
I suppose that's true. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would work with Pallidosa, you know, because by the time
marshy ground.
by the time the females can actually go anywhere other than the immediate vicinity of where the pupae were, where they've emerged, they've been mated and laid most of their eggs.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
so they may well end up there with a few eggs going that way, but I wouldn't see that as a big driver with Pallidosa.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Bruno again says that she's read on the Soil Association website of a study about spraying garlic solution had some effect. Can we trial some more natural methods? I've also been considering spraying effective microbes this year to enhance soil biome. I could do a count before and after. It could be interesting. So any thoughts on that approach?
Yeah,
I have seen data packages on garlic preparations, and I have to say that they are less than convincing. You know, it's on. I've not seen any data that would suggest applying garlic has any role in pest management. But that's just.
No, fair enough. Ashley and Archie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I know. I know that Stephen, who's here, has used it in the confined spaces on mushroom pests, various oils, you know, garlic oil and pepper oil and things like that. But you know, used in the wild, I think might be a different matter. Is what Rod is saying there. There's so many factors involved. But I mean, it's something that we have to investigate, and you know, Aislinn's work in the biome as well. You know, the soil is what they say, it's a rainforest beneath your feet. So how everything interacts and how you can adjust it is a huge area at the moment. So certainly it's you know, adjusting the biome to increase plant productivity and also pest control is just a whole new area.
Listen, that's all the questions, and I'd like to thank all. Oh, sorry, we've one more here before we finish off. Farming here on very heavy clay in Fermanagh Farm, where through the past 5 years, been no cattle have been housed in August, September, and there's no ability to graze at all. They're grazed down tight, which might limit the grain flies being laid during these key weeks. Is there no means of making a case that the DAERA spray could be permitted for a selected area, which is a proven problem with leather jackets? So that's the thing, is there a prospect of DAERA coming back? Now, my understanding, Archie, from what you had said earlier, was the reason DAERA is banned is not actually because of environmental reasons, it's because of human health reasons and the danger to the spray and the danger to operator. Is that right, Archie?
Yeah, I think you're probably looking at getting sued. That sort of risk. Particularly as it has been raised as a health hazard. So any bystanders or anybody who wants to make trouble can do that. So I think it'd be highly unlikely. But I say I'll defer to Rod, because Rod's more experienced in the area. But
yeah, I don't. It struck me that a lot of chemicals that have been withdrawn under EU legislation, they've come back as emergency authorization applications right across Europe. Chlorpyrifos isn't one of them, and I get the sense that there is no willingness from the manufacturers to actually pursue applications in Europe.
At one point, it's a remarkable turnaround, because at one point chlorpyrifos was one of the, if not the most widely used insecticide in the world. So it's a huge decision to withdraw it. And we can see the effects in crop protection here.
Paul Fagan asked, do the pesticides kill dung beetles? Dung flies and beetles? There's pluses and minuses. Obviously, you're maybe not just killing leather jackets, you're killing things like dung beetles, which obviously have beneficial effects in terms of parasite control.
Yeah, certainly it depends on the insecticide, but like chlorpyrifos is fairly broad spectrum, so it will, kill. I mean, I say the soil is a bit of a rainforest underneath your feet, so there's lots of calembula and mites and other organisms in the soil, and which has an effect on the soil biome. So chlorpyrifos would take a lot of these organisms out, including dung beetles and other beneficials.
Okay.
Certainly, there was a study done in the 70s, I think it was 60s and 70s, maybe into the early 80s, at the Grassland Research Institute when he was at Hurley, where they applied broad spectrum insecticides to the same plots year after year after year. And what they ended up with was something like a brick. They just killed everything that was in the soil, and the whole system just stopped working.
Yeah.
So yeah, for anything that's broad spectrum, there will be collateral damage.
Okay, Rod, I think that's a very good point, and I think we will bring it to a close at that. So I'd like to thank all our speakers. Archie, who's been assisted in that process by Stephen, who's been sitting quietly there, Aisling, John, and Rod for joining us this evening. My special thanks to Gillian Hoy for all the work she's putting into organising today's event, which is the final webinar in our series this autumn. I'd again like to acknowledge DAERA and the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development for the funding of this project. And finally, I request you all to fill in the feedback survey, which will appear at the end of this webinar. This feedback is always invaluable to help us in plan future events. So with that, I will wish you all a very good evening. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.